The phone felt like a brick against my ear, radiating heat. Outside, rain lashed the glass, blurring the world into gray streaks. My knee throbbed, a grinding reminder of the accident that shattered my future. My parents refused when I asked for $5,000 for my surgery. Dad said, "We'd just bought a boat." Mom said, "A limp will teach you responsibility." My sister laughed, "You'll manage." Then my broke grandpa arrived. "I gave you everything I have." He didn't know what was coming. Con. 3 hours earlier, the orthopedic surgeon had stared at the MRI like it was a map to hell. The ligament was shredded, dangling by a literal thread. He tapped the glowing screen with a pen, tracing the damage. "State-covered procedures have a 6-month waitlist, James," he said, his voice flat. "Wait that long, Con, and the joint calcifies. You won't just limp, you'll need a cane at 25. The fluorescent lights hummed, amplifying the headache building behind my eyes. $5,000 stood between me and walking. I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at the boot I couldn't lace up. My father's voice still echoed in my head, casual and dismissive. Con, he was talking about a 30-foot cruiser while I was bargaining for my mobility. They had the money. I knew they did. The remodel on their kitchen cost more than my annual salary. This wasn't about liquidity. It was about control. They wanted me desperate. They wanted me crawling back, quite literally, to beg for their approval. A tentative knock broke the silence. I grabbed my crutches, the aluminum cold against my palms, and levered myself up. Pain shot up my thigh, white-hot and jagged. I gritted my teeth and opened the door. Grandpa Arthur stood there, dripping wet in a coat 2 sizes too big. He looked smaller than I remembered, his skin papery and gray. He held a brown paper bag clutched to his chest like a shield. He shouldn't have driven in this weather, let alone visited me. "I heard about the leg," he said, stepping inside. Con, he didn't look at the sterile room, he looked only at me. His hands shook as he pushed the bag into my good hand. Inside, a stack of bills sat wrapped in a rubber band. Hundreds, 50s, mostly 20s. "It's 800, he whispered. "It is all I could get today." I looked at his hands. The calluses were there, but the grease stains were gone. He hadn't just emptied his savings account. "Your tools," I said, my voice cracking. "You sold the vintage planes." He looked away at the linoleum floor. Those tools were his life. A collection 50 years in the making. He had traded his legacy for a fraction of my medical bill. I gripped the cash until my knuckles turned white. Con. My parents bought a boat to impress strangers. My grandfather sold his soul to help me walk. I didn't take the money because it was enough. I took it because it cost him everything. The surgery was finished, funded by a loan that felt more like a shackle than relief. I lay on my mattress in the empty apartment, watching dust motes dance in the sliver of light cutting through the blinds. My leg was encased in a heavy brace, elevated on pillows that smelled like stale laundry. The interest rate on the payday loan was criminal. Every hour I lay here useless, the debt grew heavier. I checked my bank account app again. $7 remained. Hunger had become a constant, dull ache that rivaled the throbbing in my knee. My fridge contained a jar of mustard and 2 expired yogurts. I picked up my phone to distract myself and saw a photo of my mother holding a champagne flute on the deck of the Seabreeze. She looked radiant, untroubled by the fact her son was eating crackers for dinner. I turned the phone off. The silence in the apartment was loud enough to scream. A key turned in the lock, Con, followed by the shuffle of familiar boots. Grandpa Arthur pushed the door open, carrying a plastic grocery bag. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than before. "Tomato soup," he announced, setting the bag on the milk crate I used as a table. "And saltines." He pulled out a small, colorful slip of paper. "And for dessert, a tax on the stupid." He tossed a scratch-off ticket onto my chest. I picked up the ticket. It was a Lucky Sevens game, the cheap kind sold at gas stations next to the beef jerky. "I had $1 left over from the bus fare," he muttered, opening a can of soup. I grabbed a coin from the bedside table. I didn't expect anything. Hope was a dangerous thing to waste on cardboard. I scratched the first row, a cherry, a bell, then a 7, then another. I stopped scratching, my breath catching. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, violent rhythm. I scratched the prize box slowly, blowing away the gray latex dust. The number underneath wasn't a phone number, but it looked like one. $150,000. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. It wasn't millions. It wasn't a private island, but it was freedom. I looked at Grandpa, who was stirring soup in a pot, completely unaware that the air in the room had shifted electrically. My first instinct was to scream, "Con." My second was to pay off the predatory loan and buy a steak. But then I thought of my father's smirk. I thought of the boat. If I paid the debt now, I'd just be back to zero. I needed leverage. I needed a weapon. This money wasn't a safety net, it was ammunition. I slid the ticket under my pillow. "Did we win?" Grandpa asked, pouring soup into a chipped mug. "Enough for a new truck." "Not a dime." I lied, my voice steady. I hated lying to him, but he couldn't know. If he knew, he'd want me to be safe. I didn't want safety anymore. I wanted justice. I took the mug from his shaking hands. The soup was watery and undersalted, but it tasted like fuel. I would live on this cheap soup for another month. Con. I would let the interest accumulate. I would let them think I was drowning until I pulled the plug. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor made my ears pop. Con, a sensation that grounded me in the surreal reality of what I was doing. Elias Thorne's office was a fortress of glass and mahogany overlooking the city's financial district. I hobbled in on my crutches, wearing thrift store khakis that clashed violently with the Italian leather chairs. The receptionist looked at me like I was a delivery boy who got lost. Con. I didn't care. I wasn't here to impress them with my wardrobe. Thorne didn't stand when I entered his office. He remained seated behind a desk wide enough to land a plane on, studying me over the rim of his glasses. "My rate is $400 an hour," he said, his tone bored. "And I don't do charity cases for veterans." I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my jacket and placed a cashier's check for $10,000 on the polished wood. The silence stretched, heavy and expensive. "I don't want a lawsuit," I said, taking the seat opposite him. "I want an autopsy." I explained what I needed: a forensic deep dive into the finances of Robert and Linda Miller. Thorne looked at the check, then at me, his eyes narrowing with a predator's interest. He took the money. 2 weeks later, I was back in the same chair. The boredom was gone from his face, replaced by the grim fascination of a coroner examining a particularly messy corpse. Thorne slid a thick, bound dossier across the desk. "Your parents are illusionists, James," he said, tapping the cover. "And not very good ones." I opened the file. The numbers swam before my eyes, red ink bleeding across every page. The house wasn't paid off. It had been refinanced 3 times in 5 years to fund their lifestyle. They were living on a bridge of credit cards that was currently burning at both ends. They didn't own a single brick. I flipped to the section marked Assets. The boat, the Sea Breeze, was listed there. My stomach tightened. They told me they couldn't afford $5,000 for my surgery because of this boat. I said, my voice cold. Thorne nodded slowly. They couldn't afford the boat either. It's financed at 18% interest through a shell lender. They are one missed payment away from repossession on everything. The boat wasn't a prize. It was an anchor dragging them down to the bottom. Thorne leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Here is the interesting part. Their primary lender is looking to offload toxic assets to clean up their quarterly books. He looked at me meaningfully. Your parents' debt is for sale, James. Distressed debt usually goes for pennies on the dollar to collection agencies. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My parents weren't just broke, they were a commodity. A bad investment that the bank was desperate to dump on anyone willing to pay. I looked out the window at the city sprawling below, a grid of power and commerce. My parents thought they were untouchable kings of their suburban castle. In reality, they were squatters in a house of cards. I looked back at the lawyer, my pulse steady for the first time since the accident. How do I buy it? I asked. Thorne smiled, a sharp, shark-like expression. They thought they were royalty. The bank thought they were a liability. I was the collection agency. I sat in the cramped back room of the public library, the only place with free Wi-Fi and enough quiet to think. My laptop screen glowed with the registration details for Apex Holdings LLC. It was a faceless entity, a ghost in the machine designed to swallow my parents' debt without leaving a fingerprint. I transferred the lottery funds, watching the balance drop to zero. It felt reckless, yet entirely necessary. With one click, I wasn't just a disabled veteran anymore. I was a creditor. The transition was silent, digital, and absolute. Thorne handled the acquisition with surgical precision later that afternoon. The bank was eager to offload the non-performing loans, desperate to clear their books before the fiscal quarter ended. We bought the mortgage, the boat loan, and the credit lines for 30 cents on the dollar. It was terrifyingly cheap to own someone's life. When the confirmation email chimed, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold, heavy resolve. I now owned the roof over their heads and the ground beneath their feet. They were tenants in their own kingdom. I drove past the house that evening, parking my beat up Satan 2 blocks away under the cover of a weeping willow. The windows were ablaze with golden light, signaling a dinner party. I could see silhouettes moving against the curtains, glasses raised in toasts to success that didn't exist. My knee ached in the damp air, a throbbing counterpoint to their laughter. They were celebrating survival, unaware that the wolf was already inside the gate. They thought they had weathered the storm, but they didn't realize that I was the storm. Thorne made the call the next morning. He played the role of the intermediary perfectly, his voice smooth and disinterested. He offered them a lifeline disguised as a prestigious investment opportunity. A sale-leaseback agreement with a private equity firm was the pitch. They could sell the house to clear their immediate debts, pocket some cash, and rent it back. To the outside world, nothing would change. Their pride would remain intact. That was the bait. I knew they couldn't resist the illusion of status without the cost. I sat with the draft contract spread out on my bed, a red pen in hand. The standard terms were too lenient, too forgiving. I slashed through the grace periods. I crossed out the arbitration clauses. In their place, I wrote a single, non-negotiable addendum. Clause 14b, zero tolerance default. Any missed payment, late fee, or violation of property code resulted in immediate termination and eviction. No warnings. No second chances. I pressed the pen down until the tip tore the paper. It was draconian, but fair. My phone buzzed with a notification. My mother had posted a photo on Instagram. She was posing on the bow of the sea breeze, holding a glass of rosé. The caption read, "Grateful for abundance." #blessed. I looked up at Grandpa, who was counting nickels on the counter to see if we could afford laundry detergent. He was wearing a sweater with unraveled cuffs, shivering slightly in the drafty apartment. The rage I felt wasn't hot, it was absolute zero. They were feasting on the time he had sacrificed. I handed the marked-up contract to Thorne the next day. He scanned the changes, his eyebrows lifting a fraction of an inch as he read Clause 14b. "This is aggressive," he noted, looking at me over his spectacles. "If they slip up even once, they lose everything." I nodded, leaning back in the leather chair. "They won't read it," I said. "They never read the fine print." I wasn't asking them to sign a lease. I was asking them to sign a trap. The Platinum Club smelled of old money and cured meats. I wasn't there in person. I sat in my rental car 3 miles away, headphones pressed over my ears, listening to the live feed from Thorne's phone. The audio crackled with the clink of silverware. My father's voice cut through the static, booming. "We appreciate the flexibility," he said, sounding like a man doing a favor. He was negotiating from a position of total weakness, yet he still postured like a king. About the maintenance. My mother chimed in. "We expect the new owners to handle the landscaping. The roses are prize-winning." I gripped the steering wheel hard. They were selling the deed to their home to avoid bankruptcy, and she was worried about the gardener. Thorne played his part perfectly. "Apex Holdings is happy to maintain the exterior," he replied smoothly, "provided the lease terms are met." He pushed the contract across the table. The heavy paper sliding against the tablecloth sounded like a scythe. There was a pause. This was the moment. If they read Clause 14b, the deal was dead. If they saw the zero-tolerance policy, they would walk. I held my breath, listening to the static. "It's standard boilerplate," my father said, dismissing 50 pages of legal density. Con. I don't need a reading lesson. The scratch of a pen followed. He signed his name with the same arrogance he used to deny my surgery. He had just signed his execution order. And Linda, Thorne said. We need your signature as well. Another scratch. Then the rustle of papers being gathered. The funds will be wired within the hour. Thorne confirmed. On my laptop, I watched the status of the property update in real time. The county clerk's database refreshed. Owner Apex Holdings LLC. The house they were sitting in no longer belonged to them. I felt a strange hollowness. It wasn't joy. It was the cold satisfaction of a steel trap snapping shut. Excellent, my father said, the tension leaving his voice. Now, waiter, a bottle of the 2008 Cabernet. To celebrate. I closed my eyes. They had just liquidated their equity to pay off debts, and their first instinct was to burn cash on vintage wine. This was why they were drowning. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a pathology. They couldn't stop performing wealth even as the stage collapsed beneath them. The sound of the cork popping echoed like a gunshot. My sister's voice drifted in next. Does this mean we can still do the Aspen trip? I already booked the chalet. My mother laughed, a light, carefree sound that grated on my nerves. Of course, darling. We just needed to move some assets around. It's just business. Just business. The phrase hung in the air. When I needed surgery, it was bad timing. When they needed a ski trip, it was asset management. I took off the headphones. I had heard enough. I started the car, the engine rumbling to life. The ink was dry. The money was moving. Now I just had to wait. They would make the lease payments for a month, maybe two. But eventually, the facade would crack. A payment would be late. A check would bounce. And when it did, Clause 14B would be waiting. I drove away from the country club, leaving them to their illusions. The clock had started ticking, and they couldn't even hear it. November 1st came and went without a transaction. I sat in my darkened apartment, staring at the banking portal on my laptop screen. The rent payment from my parents was due by midnight. At 11:59 p.m., the account balance remained at zero. At 12:01 a.m., the notification flashed red payment missed. I didn't cheer. I didn't fist pump. I simply picked up my phone and texted Thorne 2 words. Execute Clause 14B. They had ignored the warnings, the emails, and the texts from the property management software. They assumed rules were flexible. They were wrong. Thanksgiving arrived 3 weeks later, a crisp day smelling of wood smoke and decaying leaves. I pulled up to the house, my house, and parked behind my sister's shiny new convertible. The lawn was perfectly manicured. Thanks to the maintenance checks I approved, but the rot was inside. I walked up the driveway without crutches for the first time in months. My leg felt strong, a titanium rod of purpose hidden beneath denim. I carried a store-bought pecan pie in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other. The pie was a lie. The envelope was the truth. Inside, the house was a shrine to gluttony and pretension. A 20-pound turkey sat center stage, surrounded by crystal goblets and silver candlesticks. My mother hugged me, smelling of expensive perfume and denial. You look well, she said, her eyes skipping over my leg to check if my shoes were polished. We're so glad you could make it. We have big news. My father was at the head of the table, carving the bird. Business is booming, he announced, dropping a slice of white meat onto a porcelain plate. We're finally back on top. I sat silently, pushing yams around my plate while they congratulated themselves on their genius financial maneuvering. My sister bragged about her influencer sponsorship, bought with money that should have paid the rent. The doorbell rang, sharp and intrusive. Cutting through the self-congratulatory chatter. I'll get it, I said, standing up. My father waved a dismissive hand. Probably a delivery. Tell them to leave it on the porch. I walked to the door, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't a delivery driver. It was the sheriff. I opened the door to Deputy Miller, a man I'd spoken with 3 times this week. He nodded solemnly and stepped into the foyer, removing his hat. I need to speak with the residents, he said, his voice carrying into the dining room. My father appeared instantly, napkin tucked into his collar, face flushing red. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, looking from the deputy to me. We are eating dinner. The deputy didn't flinch. Sir, I have an eviction order effective immediately. Con, you are trespassing. My father laughed, a barking sound devoid of humor. Trespassing. I own this house. Get out before I call your superior. He turned to me, expecting an ally. James, tell this idiot who I am. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply handed the manila envelope to the deputy. He opened it, reviewed the deed, and looked back at my father. According to the county records, this property is owned by Apex Holdings. You are in default of your lease. The owner is present and requesting removal. The owner. My mother appeared, clutching her pearls like a lifeline. Who is the owner? I took a step forward, closing the distance between the boy they broke and the man who rebuilt himself. I am, I said softly. The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Apex, he whispered, connecting the dots. You don't have that kind of money. He looked at my leg. Come. You're crippled. I was never crippled, I corrected him. I was injured. There is a difference. I pulled the lottery ticket receipt and the bank transfer records from the envelope. I bought your debt. I bought your house. And when you signed that lease, you agreed to the terms. My sister stood up, her face pale. James, stop it. This isn't funny. Tell them it's a joke. She looked at me with calculation, not love. She was already wondering if she could stay if she switched sides. I shook my head. My mother burst into tears, the ugly, ragged kind she usually saved for funerals. How could you? She wailed.
Yeah.
We are your family. We raised you. My father's shock turned to rage. After everything we gave you. You ungrateful. Little. I cut him off. You gave me nothing, I said, my voice level. You refused $5,000 to save my leg so you could buy a boat you didn't even own. You told me a limp would teach me responsibility. I looked him dead in the eye. I learned, I said. I learned that bills must be paid. I learned that contracts matter. I turned to the deputy. I want them out. Now. The officer stepped forward, hand resting near his belt. You have 5 minutes to grab essentials. Folks. My father looked at the turkey, then at the chandelier, then at me. The illusion of his life dissolved in real time. He slumped, suddenly an old man in a borrowed house. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a world shattering. The turkey grew cold, while the movers I hired dismantled my parents' life. They worked with efficient indifference, packing crystal vases into cardboard boxes marked FAGIL. My mother sat in her sedan, weeping into her hands, refusing to watch the dismantling of her curated world. My father paced the driveway, shouting into his cell phone, threatening lawyers who wouldn't pick up on a holiday. I stood on the porch, watching the sea breeze key chain dangle from his ignition. It was the only thing he had left. The house was already purging them. I left the sheriff to oversee the final lockout and drove across town. The neighborhood deteriorated with every mile, fading from manicured lawns to cracked pavement and barred windows. Grandpa Arthur's building smelled of boiled cabbage and damp rot. I found him sitting in his armchair, wrapping his few tools in a ragged towel. He looked up, confused by my sudden arrival. Is everything okay? He asked, fear clouding his eyes. Did something happen with the leg? Pack a bag, I said gently. We are leaving. He didn't ask questions, moving with the resignation of a man used to bad news. He packed 2 shirts, his Bible, and the photo of my grandmother. It took less than 10 minutes to fit his entire existence into a duffel bag. I looked around the room, taking in the water stains on the ceiling and the draft coming through the window frame. This place had been killing him slowly. I grabbed his tool belt from the table. You won't need the rest, I told him. The drive back was quiet. Grandpa clutched his bag on his lap, staring out the window as the scenery shifted back to wealth and privilege. When I turned into the familiar gated community, he stiffened. James, he whispered, why are we going to your father's house? They won't want me there. He tried to shrink into the seat, ashamed of his frayed collar. It's not their house, Grandpa, I said, turning the wheel. The iron gates swung open for us, obeying the transponder on my windshield. The driveway was empty. My parents' luxury sands were gone, leaving only oil spots on the pavers. The front door stood slightly ajar. Con. The lock already changed by the locksmith I'd scheduled. I helped Grandpa out of the car. He leaned on his cane, looking at the towering columns and the manicured hedges with suspicion. Con, where did they go? He asked, his voice trembling. They moved on, I said simply. Come inside. There is something I need to show you in the garage. I led him past the foyer, ignoring the echoes of the earlier shouting match. We went straight to the three-car garage. It was cavernous, smelling faintly of exhaust and my father's expensive wax. This space is useless for cars, I said, flipping the switch. But the lighting is perfect for a workshop. I handed him the receipt for the new lathe and table saw arriving Tuesday. Grandpa touched the workbench I'd dragged to the center. James, he choked out, what have you done? I didn't do it alone, I replied. Con. You bought the ticket. I walked him to the master suite, the room my parents forbade me from entering. It was stripped of their gaudy furniture, leaving only space and light. I placed the heavy brass key in his palm. His fingers curled around it, calloused skin against cold metal. This is your room now, I said. No more rent. No more mold. He wept then, Con's silent tears carving paths through the grime of his hard life. I went downstairs to check the mail pile the movers had left on the counter. Near the bottom was a letter from a maritime leasing agency, stamped, Final Notice C. I ripped it open. The Seabreeze wasn't a purchase. It was a fractional timeshare lease, a scam sold to people desperate to look rich. They had refused my surgery to pay a deposit on a boat they could only use 2 weekends a year. I laughed, a dry, bitter sound. Con. They destroyed our family for a rental. The intercom buzzed, jarring in the quiet house. I pressed the video button. My father's face filled the grainy black and white screen. He was standing at the outer gate, looking disheveled. James, he said, his voice cracking. The cards are frozen. The hotel won't take us. Open the gate. Con. We need to talk about this logically. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a bailout. He still thought this was a negotiation. He still thought he was the father and I was the resource. I stared at the screen, feeling absolutely nothing. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound indifference. The logic is simple, I said into the speaker. Con. You are trespassing. I wrote an address on a slip of paper. The local temp agency where I had worked before enlisting, and held it up to the camera. They hire daily, I said. Con. It builds character. I released the button before he could reply. I turned off the monitor, leaving him in the dark, and walked upstairs to unpack. 6 months later, the rhythm of my running shoes hitting the treadmill belt was the only sound in the gym. I increased the incline, sweat dripping off my nose, Con waiting for the familiar sharp pain in my knee. It never came. The surgery, paid for by a gamble and a sacrifice, had worked perfectly. I stepped off the machine, my legs steady beneath me. I wasn't just walking, I was sprinting. The titanium rod inside my bone wasn't a flaw anymore. It was reinforcement. I had rebuilt the foundation. I walked out to the garage, which no longer smelled of my father's imported wax and insecurity. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and sawdust. Grandpa Arthur stood at the new table saw, safety goggles perched on his nose, shaping a block of cherry wood. He wasn't the trembling old man in the apartment anymore. Con. He looked 10 years younger, his hands steady as they guided the timber. He saw me and smiled, cutting the power. Making a chair, he said proudly. Con. For the porch. I left him to his craft and went into the kitchen. My phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a blocked number, but I knew who it was. My parents called weekly, demanding money or guilt, tripping me about, family obligations. I didn't feel the old spike of adrenaline anymore. I didn't feel anger. I simply swiped left and blocked the contact. Con. They were ghosts haunting a house they no longer owned. I deleted the voicemail without listening. Silence was a luxury I could finally afford. We wouldn't stay in this mausoleum much longer. The "for sale" sign was already up in the yard. I didn't want their marble floors or the memories of their hollow parties. We were downsizing to a property with trees for Grandpa and a simple house for me. The profits would go into a trust, Con, ensuring neither of us would ever have to choose between health and dignity again. We were trading their performative wealth for actual peace. I watched the realtor lock the lockbox outside. Later, I sat in my office signing the paperwork for the Arthur Initiative. It wasn't a massive charity, just a dedicated fund to help injured veterans cover the gap between insurance and survival. It was the safety net I never had. Grandpa walked in, dusting wood shavings off his shirt. He saw the name on the documents and stopped, his eyes misting over. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. "I know," I replied, capping my pen. "That is exactly why I did it." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty driveway. My mother was right about one thing. The injury had taught me responsibility, but it wasn't the kind she meant. It wasn't about enduring abuse silently or maintaining a perfect image while rotting inside. It was about protecting the people who show up when you bleed. I watched Grandpa sand the armrest of his new chair. The limp didn't teach me responsibility. It taught me who was standing next to me when I fell.